Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 63, The Neens. I found an article where Elizabeth Neen contested the will of her husband, Alexander Neen. It stated that Alexander made his will less than 3 weeks before his death and left everything to an attendant at the Liverpool Benevolent Asylum. Elizabeth Neen contested the will, however the judge upheld Alexander's wishes. So how could a wife not lay claim and have success in obtaining the proceeds from her husband's will? Alexander Neen was born in Gloucestershire, England in 1815, the son of William Neen, a sergeant in the 90th Regiment of Foot and a sailor, and Mary Duffy. On the 20th of April 1829, Alexander, as a 12-year-old, was convicted in Aberdeen and given 7 years transportation. The other individuals involved in the crime were all aged 9 to 16 years. The victim was Dr. Brown's widowed wife, Catherine. Alexander was listed as a trade factory boy with no previous convictions. He could read but not write, Protestant, and his native place was Aberdeen. And in the newspaper, the crime was recorded. Moses Wood, John McQueen, James Forrest and Alexander Neen, all residing in Aberdeen, the whole of them mere boys, pleaded guilty of stealing from the dwelling house of Dr. William Lawrence Brown, principal of the Marischal College, on the 3rd of September 1828. 2 necklaces of coral beads, a gold seal, a brooch with 3 cameos set in gold, a silk purse containing half a sovereign and some silver, and a variety of articles of wearing apparel. They severally acknowledged being reputed common thieves. The libel also contained a charge of stealing from lockfast places in a dwelling house in Peacock's Close, but this charge was not insisted on by the public prosecutor. They were all sentenced to 7 years transportation. On the 11th of May 1829, Alexander was imprisoned on the prison hulk Retribution and then on the prison hulk Euralius, moored off Chatham on the 1st of July 1829. The Lady Harewood departed Sheerness for New South Wales with Alexander Neen aboard on the 17th of October 1830. Alexander arrived as a 15-year-old to New South Wales on the 4th of March 1831. He obtained his certificate of freedom on the 30th of August 1836 when he was 21. His trade was listed as a rope maker from Scone. His master was listed as Stonehouse. He was 5 foot high, light brown hair, hazel eyes, and tattoos with darts, hearts, and letters. On the 24th of October 1837, William Forsyth of Invermean, which is nowadays known as Scone, advertised that 24-year-old Alexander Neen, or Mean, absconded to the Liverpool Plains without completing his employment contract. And the advertisement says, "Notice, this is to caution the public against employing or harbouring Alexander Neen or Mean, he having lately left my service without performing his agreement. He is supposed to have gone to Liverpool Plains or New England. Description, ship Lady Harewood, native place Aberdeen, Scotland, age 24, 5 foot 8, complexion fair, hair fair to brown, hazel eyes, and disabled in left hand. William Forsyth, Invermean, October the 23rd, 1837. In 1843, Alexander had a son, Alexander, and it seems from the time he absconded, Alexander had changed the spelling of his surname from Kneen to Nean. This could also have been based on phonetics of the day. Alexander Bass Neen Jr. was born at Liverpool Plains on the 20th of June 1843. Alexander had a relationship with an Aboriginal woman at this time. On Alexander Jr.'s baptism record at St Luke's at Scone on the 27th of May 1844, his mother is not named, it just says native woman. They had another daughter, Sarah. Her birth date is unknown, however she was baptised at Liverpool Plains in 1850, and there is no mother stated on the baptismal record. It is reasonable to presume that Sarah Ems was a Collaroy woman, And Sarah Neen and Alexander Neen were both baptised on the Liverpool Plains. According to his 1873 probate file, Henry Charles Wright employed Sarah Ems on his Wallala property as a shepherd between 1864 and 1873. Henry also recruited Sarah's daughter, Sarah Neen, as his housekeeper. Alexander Jr. was known as Alec Neen. On the 24th of January 1861, he was charged with stealing wool. He got 6 months in Bathurst jail. He was 18 but gave his birth year as 1845, so was tried as a 16-year-old and referred to as a boy. And his jail photo definitely indicates an Indigenous man. So on the 9th of February 1861, the two committed for trial were Alec Neen, and in brackets it says half-caste, and Patrick Burns, commonly known as Blind Paddy, for stealing 3 bales of wool valued at £60 from James Keenan of Cheeseman's Creek on the 24th. They were apprehended by Mr. Finnerty in the act of taking the bales away to the bush. The boy Neen bolted to the bush and eluded search until the next morning, and strange to say, the blind man also tried to make a bolt of it, but of course was immediately apprehended. He offered the black boy £7 or £8 to assist in rolling the wool away. So his 6 months sentence was up and was mentioned in the paper on the 29th of August 1861. Return of prisoners discharged from the Bathurst jail during the week of the 25th of August 1861, Alec Neen. Alexander Jr. married Annie Genders, an Aboriginal woman, in April 1875 at Pullameni Station near Tamworth in New South Wales. Her father was an English convict, Joseph Genders, and an Aboriginal mother. And on the 2nd of April 1879 at Gunnedah, a warrant has been issued by the Gunnedah bench for the arrest of Alexander Main, charged with stealing a horse that was recovered, the property of Charles Gould. Main is 35 years of age, 5'7" high, stout build, round features with black curly hair, dressed in a black suit and Scotch cap, dirty appearance, a half-caste, believed to have gone towards Barraba. So at this point, Alexander is adjusting his name slightly, no doubt because he'd had a previous conviction, was hoping that his name was not going to be cross-referenced. In 1885, Alexander was working at a shepherd at Rocky Creek in New South Wales. Alec and Annie had 9 children all up. Their first child was born in 1866 at Mount Lindsay when Alec was 23 and Annie was 19. They had had a further 4 children before their marriage in 1875 and had another 4 children after their marriage. Annie died in 1887 when their youngest child was only 2, and an inquest was held into her death. And in 1903-1904, Alec was living at West Narrabri. Alexander Jr. died in 1919 in Narrabri, New South Wales. Sarah Neen was the second child of Alexander Neen and Sarah Ems. Sarah Neen had a child to Henry Wright around 1864 when she was 14 and Henry was 25. And they had a further 2 children in 1868 and 1870, John and Eliza. Remember that Sarah came with her mother to work on Henry Wright's property in 1864. And it seems that Sarah was known as Sarah Wright in the township, even though they did not legally marry. Henry Charles Wright was born in June 1839 in England, and he arrived on the ship Shakamakson on the 25th of November 1859 at Moreton Bay, Queensland. His occupation listed as an agricultural labourer. He moved to the township of Boggabri, halfway between Narrabri and Gunnedah, by 1864, and was granted a conditional lease at Barrow Creek, 18 miles west of Boggabri, in December 1870 of 120 acres. Henry died on the 17th of March 1873 at Boggabri with no will, and he was listed as a bachelor. Henry and Sarah's youngest child Eliza was only 3 at the time of Henry's death. Due to him dying without a will, there needed to be an investigation into the holdings of Henry and any other property so people could claim on his will. The Clark brothers owned a property virtually next door, Gullandaddy Station, and they were Sarah Neen's benefactors following the death of Henry Charles Wright. There is a letter that stated that they immediately offered asylum to Sarah and her children after Henry Wright's death. However, it's up for question whether they were simply good Samaritans or were they looking after Sarah to maintain the silence that Henry Wright did have an Indigenous woman as his common-in-law wife and had children to her. They stated in the letter that they'd already spent £43 on helping Sarah and the children, and it's quite possible that this was their way of claiming Henry's estate, considering that he had no other legal spouse or other family in Australia. So the three children that they had together, the firstborn was Henry Charles Wright Jr. He was born around 1864 near Boggabri. He married Charlotte Wright in 1889 at Gunnedah, and they had 5 children. Henry died at Texas, Queensland in December 1942, aged 78. Their second child, John Wright, was born in 1868 near Boggabri. He was a shearer at a property called Telwood near Toowoomba, Queensland, for quite a few years, and he died there in November 1940, aged 72. It doesn't seem that he married or had children, and on his death certificate his parents were listed as Henry Charles and Isabel Nevin. Their third child, Eliza Wright, was born near Boggabri in 1870. She married Anslin Scott in Sydney in 1890, and they had one son, William Edward Scott, on the 4th of November 1887, when she was 17, prior to their marriage. Anslin died in December 1891. She then had a relationship with George Eldridge that bore 5 children between 1896 and 1890, and they lived at Hawkins Creek. George was listed in 1901 as having a wife and 2 daughters, which would have been their first 2 born children, Queenie and Florence. Eliza died on the 25th of May 1926, aged 56, at Newcastle, New South Wales. Sarah had a baby in 1876, which she named Emily Wright at Boggabri. It could not have been Henry Charles Wright's child, as he died in 1873. Emily Wright's marriage certificate stated that her father was William Wright, a farmer. However, her death certificate states that her parents are Robert Sewell and Jane Neen. On her admission records to a home for pregnant young girls, she states that her father is by the surname of Kellett, who died when she was 1 year old. She also states that her mother died when she was 2, so 1878. However, this can't be the case, as Sarah had a child in 1879, and that she's got 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Family trees, however, have her father as being Henry Charles Keating, who was a drover on Mookie Station near Quirindi, New South Wales, where some records show that's where Emily was born. Henry Keating was 27 and Sarah would have been 20 when Emily was born. In 1875, he was contracted to deliver mail between Boggabri and Baraba, so he was certainly in the area in that time. And Henry Keating went on to marry Maria Holman in Rockhampton, Queensland in 1883. He may not have even known that he had a daughter with Sarah, or he left Sarah in order to marry Maria. Emily was also known as Emma, and in 1880 she was in domestic service with Mrs. Jane Craig in her settler's hut in Dangars, Upper Manila. So that meant that around 4 years old, she was placed into the hands of Mrs. Craig. She was a widow and she lived with her partner, Mr. Pike, and Emma was still with them in 1890 when she was about 14. That information was gleaned from an article where Mrs. Craig reported to police that there was a man living nearby that had gained access to the home and attempted to assault Emily. Emily, under the name of Emma, had a son, Leo, on the 28th of November 1900 in the Salvation Army home at Wickham, New South Wales. She was admitted on the 25th of September 1900. She stated that she was 21, but based on her birth records, she would have been closer to 24. She stated that her relative was Mrs. Eldridge of Baraba, which was her sister Eliza, but that Eliza didn't currently know of her whereabouts. Family trees have John Thomas Castle, or Jack as he was known, as Leo's father, and Jack would have been 20 when Leo was born. Leo also took on the name Jack Brown at times during his life, and he died in Newcastle in 1960. Emily then went on to have another son, Herbert James Wright, known as Bertie, at Cox's Creek, Burrabri, on the 7th of December 1908. No father was listed, and it was not until Emily placed a notice in the Police Gazette that the father's identity was uncovered. On the 16th of September 1908, the Police Gazette notice says Hans Christian Hansen failed to make adequate provision for his infant son. He was 23 years old, clean-shaved, 5'8", fair-haired, and a scar on the left side of his forehead. He was recently employed on the Manila to Barabah Railway Works, and the complainant was Emily Wright at Boggabri. Now, those dates don't completely line up. So Bertie's birth was listed on the 7th of December 1908. It could be that she just took a bit of time to register her son's birth, which is quite likely. In 1910, Emily Wright was summoned before the Gunnedah bench by Senior Sergeant Borthistle of Gunnedah Police, charged with committing perjury at the Gunnedah Police Court, and she was committed for trial at the Tamworth Sessions and admitted to bail. On the 16th of February 1911, it says the judge finds Emily Wright guilty of perjury and sentences her to 6 months light labour at Long Bay. Her sentence is to be commuted to a 12-month good behaviour bond of £80, but this amount has not yet been paid. 2 days later, it mentions that Emily Wright, charged with perjury, was sentenced to 6 months light labour at Long Bay Penitentiary for Women, and the sentence was suspended upon finding £80 security for good behaviour for 6 months. So Emily didn't end up being jailed in the end. In 1912, there's another Police Gazette article under deserting wives and families. Boggabri, a commitment warrant for £8.12 and 6 shillings costs in default to be imprisoned until the order is complied with, having been issued by the Boggabri bench against Hans Christian Hansen for disobeying a magisterial order for the support of his child. He's 27, 5'8", high, fair hair, clean-shaved, scar on left side of forehead, patch of white hair on back of head, walks with a peculiar gait, dressed in a green-coloured sack suit and small black hard hat, a labourer. There is a follow-up notice in the Police Gazette on the 11th of December 1912 saying the commitment warrant against Hans Christian Hansen for disobeying a magisterial order for the support of his child has been executed by Constable Tracy at Moree Police, the amount and costs paid. Emily married John Wandless William Searle in Boggabri in 1922. Emily was 49 and John was 50, and John died only a year after they were married in Tamworth. In 1930, Emily is featured in the census using her maiden name and was living in Newcastle in New South Wales, and this is where she died at the age of 69 on the 14th of August 1942. So getting back to Emily's mother, Sarah. So Sarah went on to have a relationship with Robert Sewell after Emily's birth. Robert was a shepherd on the Hobden sheep station at Barrow Creek, and that's where they had their daughter, Isabella, on the 21st of July 1877. On Isabella's birth certificate, it stated that Robert had married Sarah in August 1865 at Weewa, New South Wales, and they had 7 children alive, 3 males and 4 females, with 2 males deceased. It seems that Sarah dates their marriage, in inverted commas, to cover the birth dates of her children. So the earliest of her children was Henry Wright Jr., born in 1864. So it seems like she's gone back and covered that in that record. Robert Sewell married Ellen Mansfield only 7 months after their second child was born. And then after the death of his wife, Ellen, he married again in 1905. So it seems that he deserted Sarah with the 2 children. And the 2 children, Isabella Newell, who was born in 1877, she married James John Wicks at Tamworth, New South Wales in 1903, and they had 3 children. Isabella died in October 1909 at Barabah. She was only 32 years old, and it was only 2 months after she gave birth to their 3rd child, who died at 8 days old. And their second child, Robert Sewell, He was born on the 14th of January 1879 near Barabba, New South Wales. And the death of Sarah Neen is unknown. There is no definite death certificate stating when Sarah Neen passed away. So getting back to Alexander Neen Sr., by 1851, only a year after his daughter Sarah's birth, Alexander is found in West Maitland, over 100 kilometres away from Scone, so it is safe to assume that he deserted Sarah Ems and possibly had no contact with his children from that time on. On the 3rd of December 1851, there was a £1 reward offered. Lost on Monday in Maitland, a pocketbook containing 3 £1 notes and an order drawn by George Thomas and Andrew Loader in favour of Alexander Neen on themselves for £12. Any person leaving the above at Mr Thomas Brown's Royal Oak Inn, Campbell's Hill, West Maitland, shall receive a reward of £1. Alexander Neen, West Maitland, 2nd of December 1851. It does state on Alexander's death certificate that he married in 1868 to Elizabeth Byron. However, a marriage certificate can't be found. If this marriage did in fact happen, then this occurred a good 8 to 10 years after he had his children with Sarah Ems. So Elizabeth Byron, known as Bet, was born in Maitland, New South Wales in 1837. She was the daughter of Peter Byron and Elizabeth Matthews, who are both convicts. On the 23rd of December 1867, Elizabeth, listed as Elizabeth Neen, was imprisoned for 3 months for vagrancy in Inverell, New South Wales, and she was discharged on the 21st of March 1868. So it was quite clear at that point with the dates that she was naming herself as Elizabeth Neen before they officially married, if they did in fact marry. On the 26th of July 1870 at Glen Innes, New South Wales, Henry Hunt and Bet Neen robbed Patrick O'Brien on the Ranger Valley Road, 12 miles west of Glen Innes. Bet was acquitted for this crime and released from custody on the 9th of August 1870. On December the 1st, 1870, she was imprisoned for horse stealing at Waller, New South Wales, and received 12 months in Maitland Jail. She was released on the 7th of February 1871. Her jail record stated she was 31 years old, 5'6" and stout. Her complexion was dark and she had hazel eyes. On the 4th of November 1872, Elizabeth was charged again with vagrancy and sentenced to 6 months hard labour at Maitland Jail, and her birth year on this record is 1840. On the 4th of November 1873, Alexander was driving a team of bullocks carrying tin ore from the coast when his leg was severely crushed between the dray wheel and the cutting. He was taken to Grafton Hospital and he was then 53 years of age. In 1889. In Sydney, it says that a warrant has been issued by the Central Police Bench for the arrest of 3 men whose names are unknown but who can be identified, charged with winning to themselves by the means of unlawful device, to wit the paper trick, from Alexander Neen of the sum of £300 with intent to defraud on the 11th. And it states that the complainant, Alexander Neen, was living at 71 King Street. And on the 2nd of May 1890, on the inquest resuming after a short adjournment, as reported in our first edition, Alexander Neen, an elderly gentleman, said that he had been stopping at Lily's Glasgow restaurant in York Street for the past 3 months. Alexander died on the 5th of March 1898 in the Liverpool Benevolent Asylum in New South Wales, aged 82. Elizabeth married Robert Allen in June 1898, when she said she was 54, but she would have been 61. Robert was 40. In the Liverpool Herald on the 3rd of September 1898, there was an article titled "A Contested Will." It says, at the Probate Court, Sydney, on Tuesday last, before Judge Walker, an application was made on behalf of James Brown for the probate of the will of the late Alexander Neen. Mr Thompson objected on behalf of Elizabeth Neen, widow of the testator, on the grounds of the alleged undue influence having been exercised, and at the time of making his will, the testator was not in a proper disposing mind. The circumstances in this case were somewhat out of the common. On December the 29th, 1897, the testator, who was then an old man, was admitted to the Liverpool Benevolent Asylum, and on the following day, The attendant discovered in his possession bank deposit receipts for between £800 and £900. The documents were handed for safekeeping to the clerk of the institution, and Neen entered into an agreement to pay for his maintenance. At the time of his admission, he was suffering from a malignant cancer, and his condition gradually became worse. During his illness, he was looked after by James Brown, who was one of the attendants, and the evidence went to show that his attention was kindly to a degree. On the 10th of February 1898, Neen made a will, of which Brown was the universal legatee. The testator had been asked whether he had a wife, and in reply had said that he had one once, but had not heard of her for 12 years and did not know if she was alive or not. The testator died on the 5th of March, and as stated by one of the witnesses, left money for funeral expenses, but his remains were buried in a pauper cemetery. His Honour, having taken the evidence on both sides, and accordingly Mr. Thompson proceeded to point out that the case was one of such a character that the opponent of the will was justified in coming before the court and asking that all suspicion in regard to the manner in which the will was made should be removed, and that consequently Mrs. Neen's costs should come out of the estate. Mr. Thompson also stated that he was unable to place Mrs. Neen in the witness box. She, like her deceased husband, suffered from cancer and was unable to attend. In giving judgment, His Honour said that he had no hesitation in saying that the plaintiff must succeed. The will of the testator, it appeared, had been prepared upon instructions given to the solicitor by the plaintiff, who took the beneficiary interest under the will. The position which Brown occupied towards the testator was one which rendered it tolerably easy matter for him to exercise control over Neen. It was not a fiduciary position, certainly, but the relationship was of such a character that the court closely scrutinised the evidence in order that any ground of suspicion should be removed. In this case, the evidence was all one way. The testator had stated that he had not heard of his wife for 12 years, and then she was serving a sentence in Maitland Jail, and he had 2 nieces. There was no evidence that these statements were erroneous in fact, or that the testator was suffering from any delusion, or that he was in any way making a mistake. There being nobody who had a natural claim upon him, the case was different from one in which the testator left out of consideration his relations with whom he had lived on intimate terms and who naturally ought to be remembered in his testamentary dispositions. As no one had a natural claim, he would either have to leave his estate to someone who had no such claim or die intestate. Apparently Brown, his attendant in the asylum, had treated him with kindness, and the will was made in his favour. The witnesses called satisfied His Honour as to their credibility, and the evidence adduced had removed all suspicion that might have arisen. There was no evidence of the testator's incapacity, and all the witnesses who had opportunities of judging his capability had stated that up to a time subsequent to the making of his will, he was perfectly rational. His Honour accordingly made order in favour of the plaintiff. A week later, it was mentioned in the probate court motion for rehearing, Brown versus Neen. Mr. S.A. Thompson, instructed by Mackenzie, appeared on behalf of the caviter, Elizabeth Neen, widow of the testator Alexander Neen, and Mr. Gordon, instructed by Mr. Marsden, appeared for the respondent James Brown. Mr. Thompson moved for a rehearing of this suit on the grounds that fresh evidence has been discovered bearing upon the alleged incapacity of the testator to make a will. His Honour dismissed the motion with costs, but extended the time within the present applicant might appeal for 1 week. And then it mentions that His Honour said that he had decided the case on the evidence before him. The only new evidence it was proposed to bring now was with reference to the state of mind of the testator prior to his admission to the asylum. This being so, and there being no new evidence affecting his state of mind subsequent to his admission, this proposed evidence would, in his opinion, have to be disregarded if he believed the evidence of those who testified as to the testator's state of mind when in the asylum, and upon whose evidence he had decided the suit. He did not see how he could, on this evidence, grant a rehearing before himself. He therefore dismissed the motion with costs. In the affidavit of death for Alexander Neen, and Arthur Fleming, who was an attendant at Liverpool Benevolent Asylum, stated that the deceased departed his life at Liverpool on the 5th of March 1898. In Neen's will, written on the 10th of February 1898, less than a month before he died, He wrote, "I devise and bequeath all my real and personal property of whatever description and wheresoever situated unto James Brown of Liverpool, aforesaid an attendant of the above asylum, absolutely and forever." He also appointed Brown to be sole executor. The will is signed with a very shaky hand and the name is barely recognisable. Surprisingly, the inventory in Neen's will shows that he had nearly £800 deposited in various bank accounts. Notification of the application for probate was placed in the Telegraph, and the Commissioner's statement, he signs the document saying, "I find that there has not been any caveat entered against the granting of this probate." A caveat is where someone takes out a stop to granting the probate until their opposition to the provisions can be judged. Further into the probate packet, there is a judgment from the Supreme Court in a case with Elizabeth Neen and James Brown. Elizabeth did take out a caveat to challenge the validity of the will and to stop the money being paid to Brown. So did James Brown pressure Neen into making that last will? Why was Alexander Neen in a destitute asylum if he had £800 in bank accounts? Did Elizabeth place Alexander in the asylum to be rid of him so she could marry? Elizabeth herself actually died only a year later in 1899 in Inverell, New South Wales. Alexander Neen had a brother William, who was likely to have been the convict William Keane, who was transported for 7 years and brought out on the Marquis of Huntly on the 23rd of March 1835, arriving on the 5th of July 1835 to New South Wales. He married Margaret Colquhoun, a Scottish woman, at St James's in Sydney on the 31st of October 1844. The Governor gave consent on the marriage certificate. They had 6 children, a boy and 2 girls, that survived into adulthood. So the 2 nieces that Alexander was referring to when he was talking to John Brown at the asylum in regards to his will could quite possibly have been his brother's 2 daughters. William died on the 24th of May 1862 at Shoalhaven, New South Wales, aged only 45. And on the 30th of May 1862, there is an article outlining William Neen's death. Fatal accident. An accident happened here on Thursday night last, resulting in the death of William Neen. It appears that Neen on that day took his dray to bring some things from the river, and that it was dark when he left for home. His bullocks were young and restive, and Kennedy at the ferry, dreading some harm, tried to persuade him to remain there all night, but without avail. By Neen's own account, when about a mile from home he missed his foot and trying to jump on the dray, and the wheel went over him. He made a second attempt, and again the wheel passed over him about the region of his stomach. He was found in the morning suffering very much from thirst and inward pain by James Everson, who'd taken him home and the doctor sent for. Neen died the following morning. An inquest was held by the coroner in the afternoon, when a verdict given that the deceased came to his death by injuries received from the dray he was driving passing over his body. It was a matter of surprise to the jury that the body showed no external marks of injury, although the dray and the load must have weighed considerably over a tonne. So after hearing the story of Alexander Neen, you're probably wondering why a court case occurred between his carer at a benevolent asylum and an ex-wife who left him and didn't seem to be an upstanding citizen of her own. And we do know that he did have 2 children. He had Alexander Jr. and Sarah, but it seems because of their Aboriginal descent and the fact that he was not legally married to their mother, that even if they did try and claim his will, I'm not sure whether they would have had any success.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.